The massive chamber stretched beyond what most species could comprehend, its crystalline walls pulsing with the soft blue light of processed stellar energy. Here, in the heart of the Galactic Dominion Council, representatives from 1,000 worlds gathered to discuss matters that shaped the fate of entire star systems. The air recyclers hummed quietly, mixing atmospheric compositions suitable for the diverse assembly of beings that called this place the center of civilized space. At the center of the chamber sat the high throne, carved from a single piece of neutronium and suspended by gravitational fields that had been perfected over millennia. Upon it rested Overlord ZYX, a being whose species had ruled the galaxy for over 50,000 years. Her 6 arms moved with practiced grace as she manipulated the holographic displays that showed the current state of the Dominion's vast empire. 300 billion star systems, each one contributing to the glory and prosperity of the Council. The morning session had begun like any other. Minor disputes between trading partners, resource allocation discussions, and the routine business of managing an empire that spanned half the galaxy. But today carried a special significance that had many of the council members shifting nervously in their designated spaces. Today, they would address the newest addition to their empire: humanity. The species had been discovered only 5 standard years ago, a remarkable find considering how long they had managed to remain hidden in their small corner of the Orion Arm. When the Dominion's exploration fleets had finally reached the Sol system, they had expected to find either primitive creatures barely capable of interplanetary travel, or perhaps the ruins of a civilization that had destroyed itself, as so many young species did. Instead, they found something unprecedented. The humans had not only achieved faster-than-light travel, but had done so using principles that the Dominion's greatest scientists still struggle to understand. Their ships moved through space using technology that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality itself, creating tunnels through dimensions that the Council's physicists insisted should not exist. More disturbing still, these humans had somehow managed to colonize nearly 200 worlds in the span of less than 1,000 years. For a species that the Dominion estimated to be barely 10,000 years old in terms of civilization, this was impossible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Human colonies dotted the local star systems, each one thriving with populations in the billions. Their technology, while different from anything the Dominion had ever encountered, was clearly effective. Some of their innovations were so advanced that several council members had privately suggested that perhaps humanity had received help from an unknown benefactor. The discovery had sent shockwaves through the established order. For 50 millennia, the Dominion had followed a simple pattern when encountering new species: first contact, evaluation, integration, and, finally, tribute. Every species that joined the galactic community was expected to contribute to the greater good of the Empire. It was a system that had worked flawlessly for thousands of generations. But humanity presented unique challenges. Unlike most species that were discovered while still confined to their homeworlds, humans had already established a significant presence across multiple star systems. Their military capabilities were unknown but, presumably substantial, given their rapid expansion. Most concerning of all, initial diplomatic contacts had revealed that humans possessed something that made many council members deeply uncomfortable. They asked questions. Not the usual questions that newly discovered species asked about galactic law, trade regulations, or cultural exchange programs. Humans asked fundamental questions about the nature of the Dominion itself. They wanted to know why the Council had the right to govern species they had never met. They questioned the tribute system that formed the backbone of the galactic economy. They even had the audacity to ask what would happen if a species simply refused to join. Such questions had not been asked in the Council chambers for over 20,000 years. Ambassador Veltar of the Zek-Ni Confederacy had been the one to first suggest that perhaps humanity should be approached differently. The Zek-Ni were among the oldest members of the Dominion, having joined voluntarily nearly 30,000 years ago when their homeworld faced extinction from a dying star. They had always been voices of moderation in council affairs, often serving as mediators when younger species struggled to adapt to galactic civilization. But Overlord ZYX had dismissed such concerns with the casual authority of her position. The Dominion had protocols for dealing with new species, protocols that had been refined over millennia of successful integration. Humanity would be no different. They would receive the standard First Contact package, a comprehensive introduction to galactic law and their obligations as new citizens of the civilized galaxy. They would be given the customary adjustment period to organize their tribute payments. And, then, they would take their place alongside the hundreds of other species that contributed to the greater good. The human delegation had arrived 3 days ago for this formal ceremony. Ambassador Sarah Chen, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see everything, led a team of 12 other humans. They had been polite, professional, and remarkably well-informed about galactic politics considering their recent introduction to the wider universe. They had asked for copies of all relevant laws and regulations, which had been provided. They had requested detailed explanations of the tribute system, which had been given. They had even inquired about the historical precedents for species that had attempted to negotiate alternative arrangements. That last question had caused some concern among the council staff, but the answer was simple enough. There were no such precedents. Every species either joined willingly or was integrated by force. The galaxy was far too large and complex to allow for individual arrangements that might undermine the stability of the entire system. Now, as Overlord ZYX Thera activated the formal session protocols, the chamber fell silent. The tribute ceremony was about to begin, and, by its conclusion, humanity would officially become the newest member of the Galactic Dominion. Their assessment had been completed months ago by the Council's economic specialists. Earth and its colonies would be required to contribute 15% of their gross planetary production annually, a rate that reflected both their technological capabilities and their rapid expansion. Additionally, they would provide military service to the Dominion fleet, contributing both ships and personnel to help maintain order throughout the galaxy. It was, by galactic standards, quite generous. Many species were required to contribute 20 or even 25% of their production, especially those whose integration had required military intervention. The Dominion's economists had calculated that humanity's contribution would be substantial enough to fund the construction of 3 new sector defense fleets while still allowing human civilization to continue its expansion under Dominion oversight. The holographic displays throughout the chamber shifted to show detailed analyses of human economic output, population distributions, and military capabilities. The numbers were impressive, even by galactic standards. In just 5 years of observation, Dominion intelligence had documented significant advances in human technology, suggesting a rate of innovation that exceeded most species' development over centuries. Citizens of the Dominion, Overlord ZYX Thera's voice resonated through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers, reaching every corner of the vast space. Today we gather to welcome our newest members into the prosperity and security of galactic civilization. The formal words had been spoken countless times before, part of a ritual that stretched back to the very founding of the Dominion. Behind the Overlord, the Chamber of Histories displayed the names and dates of every species' integration, a testament to the Dominion's success in bringing order to the galaxy. Humanity's entry would soon join that illustrious list. Ambassador Chen and her delegation stood in the designated area for new member representatives, a circular platform that placed them at the center of the chamber's attention. The human ambassador's expression was calm, almost serene, as she listened to the opening ceremonies. Her colleagues showed similar composure, though several council members noted that the humans seemed unusually attentive to the specific wording of each ceremonial declaration. The ritual continued with the traditional recounting of the Dominion's founding principles. How the great species of the galaxy had come together 50,000 years ago to create a system of government that would prevent the chaos and warfare that had plagued earlier eras. How the tribute system ensured that every world contributed according to its capabilities, creating prosperity for all. How military service in the Dominion fleets provided protection and opportunity for young people from every member species. Each principle was illustrated with historical examples and statistical analyses that demonstrated the system's effectiveness. Trade volumes that dwarfed the economic output of entire galaxies in previous eras. Scientific advances that had extended lifespans and improved living conditions across 1,000 worlds. Military victories that had protected countless civilizations from threats both external and internal. As the presentation continued, some of the older council members began to notice something unusual about the human delegation's behavior. While most newly inducted species showed clear signs of being overwhelmed by the scope and grandeur of galactic civilization, the humans appeared almost bored. They took notes, asked occasional clarifying questions through their translation devices, and exchanged quiet comments among themselves, but they showed none of the awe that typically characterized this moment. It was Ambassador Veltar who first realized what was happening. The humans weren't learning about the Dominion for the first time. They were conducting an evaluation. The formal presentation concluded with the traditional display of military might that served both to inspire new members and remind them of the consequences of non-compliance. Holographic projections showed the Dominion's vast fleets, tens of thousands of ships ranging from small patrol vessels to massive dreadnoughts capable of reducing entire planets to molten slag. The numbers were staggering even by galactic standards, over 2 million active military vessels, with production facilities capable of replacing losses faster than any conceivable enemy could inflict them. The humans watched this display with the same calm attention they had given everything else, occasionally making notes but showing no visible reaction to the implied threat. If anything, several of them appeared to be conducting technical analyses of the ships being displayed, their portable devices scanning and recording details that most species wouldn't even notice. Finally, Overlord HFY began the concluding phase of the ceremony. The Galactic Dominion Council has completed its evaluation of the human species and their colonies. Based on comprehensive analysis of your capabilities, resources, and strategic value, we have determined the appropriate contribution that humanity will make to the continued prosperity of galactic civilization. The tribute assessment appeared on displays throughout the chamber, broken down by category and payment schedule. 15% of gross planetary production, to be delivered quarterly to designated collection facilities. Military service quotas that would require humanity to provide 50,000 personnel annually for integration into Dominion forces. Technology sharing agreements that would give the Dominion access to human innovations in exchange for advanced galactic technologies. The terms were presented as established fact rather than negotiable agreements. This was how the system worked. The Dominion determined what each species could contribute, and the species provided it. Simple, efficient, and proven effective across thousands of successful integrations. Ambassador Chen, the Overlord continued, you will now formally accept these terms on behalf of humanity, acknowledging your species' entrance into the galactic community and your commitment to upholding the principles that have brought peace and prosperity to our galaxy. The chamber fell silent as all attention focused on the human delegation. This was the crucial moment, the point at which humanity would officially become part of the Dominion. Some of the newer council members leaned forward eagerly, curious to witness their first formal integration ceremony. The older members sat back in their designated spaces, having seen this ritual hundreds of times before. Ambassador Chen stepped forward to the speaking platform, her movement causing automatic adjustments in the chamber's acoustic systems to ensure her words would be clearly heard throughout the vast space. The translation systems activated, preparing to broadcast her acceptance in the primary languages of all major Dominion species. She looked up at Overlord HFY, then let her gaze sweep across the assembled council members, taking in the representatives of hundreds of worlds and billions of citizens. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and confident, carrying easily through the chamber's audio systems. On behalf of humanity and all human colonies, I have been instructed to provide our response to your tribute demands. The phrasing was slightly unusual, but not unprecedented. Some species preferred to use their own ceremonial language before providing the traditional acceptance. The council waited patiently for Ambassador Chen to continue with the expected formalities. Instead, she paused, consulting a small device that several observers recognized as a communication link to her home government. She nodded once, as if receiving final confirmation of her instructions, then returned her attention to the assembled council. Humanity's response to your tribute assessment is as follows. Another pause, this one longer than the first. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the ambassador appeared to be choosing her words carefully. Some council members began to shift nervously, sensing that something was not proceeding according to the usual pattern. Finally, Ambassador Chen spoke again, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast chamber. No. The single word hung in the air like a physical presence, creating a silence so complete that the normal background hum of the chamber's environmental systems seemed thunderously loud. For several long moments, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The translation systems, confused by the unexpected brevity of the response, repeated the word in dozens of languages, each repetition seeming to make the silence that followed even more profound. Overlord Zyxthera was the first to break the frozen tableau, her 6 arms moving in a gesture that indicated confusion rather than anger. I'm sorry, Ambassador Chen, but there appears to have been a translation error. Could you please repeat your response to the tribute assessment? Ambassador Chen smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both polite and utterly unyielding. There was no translation error, Overlord. Humanity's response to your demands is no. We decline to pay tribute. We decline to provide military service. We decline to share our technology. We decline, in fact, to recognize the Galactic Dominion Council's authority over human space or human citizens. The chamber erupted. Shouts of outrage, disbelief, and confusion echoed from dozens of species as council members tried to process what they had just heard. Some representatives activated their own translation systems, convinced that they must have misunderstood. Others began consulting historical databases, searching for precedents that might explain how to handle such an unprecedented situation. But there were no precedents. In 50,000 years of galactic civilization, no species had ever simply refused to join the Dominion. Overlord Zyxthera raised all 6 arms in a gesture that commanded silence, and the chamber gradually quieted as discipline reasserted itself. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of strained patience, as if she were addressing a child who had failed to understand a simple concept. Ambassador Chen, I believe you may not fully comprehend the situation. The tribute assessment is not a request or a negotiation. It is a statement of fact based on your species' integration into galactic civilization. Every species contributes according to its capabilities. This is how the system works. This is how it has always worked. The human ambassador nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering the Overlord's words. I understand your perspective, and I appreciate your explanation of the system. However, I should point out that humanity never requested to join your galactic civilization. We never asked for your protection, your trade agreements, or your oversight. You discovered us, evaluated us without our permission, and now you're demanding payment for services we never requested. The logic was so fundamentally alien to the Dominion's worldview that many council members simply couldn't process it. How could any rational species not want the benefits of galactic civilization? How could they possibly prefer the chaos and inefficiency of independent development to the proven success of the Dominion model? Ambassador Veltar of the Zekan I rose from his designated space, his tall, crystalline form catching and refracting the chamber's ambient light. With respect, Ambassador Chen, I believe you may not fully appreciate the benefits that Dominion membership provides. Perhaps if we explained in greater detail the advantages of integration. We've read your materials quite thoroughly, Chen interrupted gently. Your tribute system, your military structure, your technology sharing agreements. Very impressive, from a certain point of view. But, you seem to be operating under the assumption that bigger automatically means better, and that uniformity automatically means efficiency. Humanity has some experience with large governmental systems, and we've learned that they tend to become rigid, corrupt, and ultimately self-serving rather than serving the people they claim to protect. The accusation hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several council members rose to object, their various forms of outrage creating a cacophony that took several minutes for the Overlord to control. The very suggestion that the Dominion was anything other than a benevolent force for galactic prosperity was not just wrong, it was heretical. When order was finally restored, Overlord Zyxthera's voice carried a much harder edge. Ambassador Chen, your statements suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of galactic realities. The Dominion maintains order across 300 billion star systems. Without our oversight, this galaxy would descend into chaos, warfare, and suffering. Every species benefits from our protection and our system of resource allocation. Whose protection? Chen asked, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension in the chamber. In our 5 years of observation, we've noted that the Dominion spends most of its military resources suppressing independence movements and enforcing tribute collection. Your protection seems to consist primarily of protecting yourselves from the people you claim to be protecting. The observation was accurate enough to make several council members uncomfortable, though none would admit it publicly. The Dominion's military operations over the past several thousand years had indeed focused primarily on internal threats rather than external ones. But that was simply evidence of the system's success in creating galactic stability. The Dominion fleet protects all member species from external threats, declared Admiral Korthax of the Hegemony War College, his mechanical voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of military service. Our records show successful defense against over 200 incursions by hostile forces from outside the galaxy. Ambassador Chen nodded politely. 200 incursions over 50,000 years works out to one every 250 years. Meanwhile, your own records show approximately 12,000 military operations against member species who attempted to reduce their tribute payments or withdraw from the Dominion entirely. That suggests you're about 60 times more likely to attack your own members than to defend them from outside threats. The mathematical accuracy of the statement made it impossible to dismiss, even though the conclusion was clearly unacceptable. Several council members began accessing their own databases, trying to find errors in the human's calculations that might discredit her argument. Internal security operations are necessary to maintain the stability that benefits all species, Overlord ZYX-Thera replied, but her voice carried less certainty than before. Without central authority, member species would inevitably fall into conflict with each other. Based on what evidence? Chen asked. Have you ever tried allowing species to govern themselves? Have you ever conducted experiments in local autonomy to see if your assumption about inevitable conflict is actually true? Or do you simply assume that because your system works for you, it must be the only system that could work for anyone? The questions were hitting at the very foundations of Dominion philosophy, concepts so fundamental that most council members had never even considered them as assumptions that might be questioned. The idea that the Dominion's authority might be based on untested theories rather than proven facts was genuinely disturbing to beings who had spent their entire lives believing in the righteousness of their cause. The chamber's atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense as the implications of the human position began to sink in. If humanity could simply refuse to join the Dominion, what prevented other species from doing the same? If the tribute system was actually extractive rather than beneficial, how many members might reconsider their participation if given the choice? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could undermine the stability of galactic civilization itself. Overlord ZYX-Thera seemed to recognize the need to reassert control over the situation before it spiraled completely beyond management. Her voice took on the formal tones of official authority as she addressed not just the human delegation, but the entire assembly. The Galactic Dominion Council does not recognize any species' right to exist outside the framework of galactic civilization. Humanity's colonies are located within Dominion space, using resources that belong to the galactic community, and benefiting from the stability that our presence provides. Your refusal to accept your obligations is not only unprecedented, it is fundamentally illegitimate. Ambassador Chen's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the exchange. We don't recognize your claim to own the galaxy or its resources. We don't acknowledge your authority over human space. And we certainly don't accept the legitimacy of a government that exists primarily to extract wealth from populations that never consented to its rule. The words hung in the chamber's recycled air like a challenge that could not be ignored. For 50,000 years, the Dominion's authority had been absolute. The very concept of a species that simply refused to acknowledge that authority was beyond the experience of anyone present. But the challenge had been issued, and the council would have to decide how to respond. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. The emergency session convened 18 hours after the human delegation had departed the council chambers. Ambassador Chen and her team had left peacefully, declining the Overlord's offer of extended accommodations and expressing their intent to return to human space immediately. Their departure had been courteous but final, leaving behind a council that was struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The chamber's normal configuration had been altered for this crisis meeting. Instead of the usual ceremonial arrangement, the space had been reconfigured into a more practical layout that emphasized function over form. The representatives of the Dominion's most powerful species sat in a tight circle around the central command platform, their various forms creating an alien constellation of authority and concern. Overlord ZYX-Thera had not slept during the intervening hours. Her species required very little rest compared to most galactic races, but even she felt the strain of processing the implications of humanity's rejection. The economic analysis alone was staggering. Human colonies represented potential tribute income that could fund entire sector development programs. Their technology, particularly their dimensional manipulation drives, could revolutionize galactic transportation and military capabilities. But, beyond the immediate economic concerns lay more fundamental questions that struck at the heart of everything the Dominion represented. If humanity could simply opt out of galactic civilization, what prevented other species from following their example? The Dominion's stability depended on universal participation. Even a few defections could create a cascade effect that might unravel 50,000 years of carefully constructed order. The session began with a comprehensive intelligence briefing delivered by Director Mextai of the Galactic Information Service. The GIS had spent the past day frantically compiling everything known about human military capabilities, technological resources, and strategic positioning. The results were troubling enough that several council members had requested independent verification of the data. Honored representatives, Director Mextai's synthesized voice carried a note of controlled concern as he activated the holographic displays. Our analysis indicates that humanity presents a significantly more complex challenge than our initial assessments suggested. The first display showed human territorial expansion over the past 1,000 years. The familiar star maps that most council members had seen before took on new significance when viewed from a strategic perspective. Human colonies were not randomly distributed throughout their local region. Instead, they formed a carefully planned network that controlled key hyperspace routes and strategic resources throughout a volume of space roughly equivalent to an entire Dominion sector. Our xenoarchaeology teams have confirmed that humans achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 800 standard years ago, the director continued. However, their expansion pattern suggests they spent several centuries conducting detailed surveys of their local region before beginning colonization. This indicates a level of strategic planning that far exceeds what we would expect from a relatively young species. The implications were unsettling. Most species discovered by the Dominion had expanded haphazardly, colonizing worlds based on immediate needs rather than long-term strategic considerations. Human expansion showed evidence of careful analysis and patient execution that suggested a fundamentally different approach to galactic civilization. Admiral Korthax activated his own analysis systems, cross-referencing the expansion data with military deployment patterns. Director Mextai, what are our estimates for human military capabilities? Our standard integration protocols assume that newly discovered species will possess limited defensive capabilities. The next series of displays addressed that question, and the answers were even more disturbing than the expansion data. Human military technology appeared to be based on the same dimensional manipulation principles that powered their faster-than-light drives. Their ships could apparently phase between dimensions, making them virtually impossible to target with conventional weapons. Worse still, their defensive systems seemed capable of redirecting incoming energy weapons through dimensional portals, potentially turning an attacker's own firepower against them. Our combat simulations indicate that human defensive capabilities may exceed those of most Dominion fleet units, Director Mextai admitted reluctantly. Their dimensional shielding technology appears to be several generations beyond our current understanding of spatial manipulation. The admission sent a wave of unease through the assembled representatives. The Dominion's military superiority was the foundation upon which all other aspects of galactic governance rested. If humanity possessed defensive technology that could neutralize that advantage, the entire balance of power in the galaxy might be shifting. But, the technology assessments were not the most troubling part of the intelligence briefing. As Director Mextai continued his presentation, it became clear that humanity's rejection of Dominion authority was not an impulsive decision based on incomplete information. Human intelligence gathering had been extensive and sophisticated, penetrating Dominion information networks with a thoroughness that suggested capabilities far beyond what any council member had imagined. Honored representatives, we have identified at least 47 instances over the past 2 years where human operatives accessed classified Dominion databases. They appear to have conducted comprehensive research into our governmental structure, economic systems, military capabilities, and historical records. This includes detailed analysis of every species integration over the past 10,000 years, complete records of all military interventions, and comprehensive economic data regarding tribute flows and resource allocation. The scope of human intelligence penetration was staggering. Information that the Dominion considered highly classified had apparently been freely available to human researchers. The security implications alone were serious enough to warrant a complete overhaul of galactic information systems. But the strategic implications were far worse. Ambassador Veltar of the ZEC-NI raised a crystalline appendage to request recognition. Director, are you suggesting that humanity's rejection of our authority was based on complete knowledge of our capabilities and methods? That appears to be correct, Ambassador. Our analysis indicates that the human government has detailed information regarding every aspect of Dominion operations. They knew exactly what they were refusing when Ambassador Chen delivered their response. The chamber fell silent as the full implications of this revelation sank in. Humanity's rejection had not been based on ignorance or misunderstanding. They had studied the Dominion thoroughly, analyzed its strengths and weaknesses, and concluded that they preferred independence to membership in galactic civilization. Overlord ZYX-Thera found the conclusion almost incomprehensible. How could any rational species reject the benefits of Dominion membership after studying the system thoroughly? The galactic economy provided prosperity beyond what any single species could achieve alone. The military protection offered security that had prevented major conflicts for thousands of years. The technological sharing agreements accelerated development for all participants. Director Mextai, she said finally, what does your analysis suggest regarding human motivations? What could possibly lead them to prefer isolation over participation in galactic civilization? The director's response required him to access data files that he clearly found uncomfortable to discuss. Our behavioral analysis teams have identified several factors that appear to influence human decision-making. First, their species appears to place unusual value on what they term self-determination, the ability to make decisions regarding their own governance without external influence. Second, they seem to view the tribute system as taxation without representation, a concept from their historical political development that they consider fundamentally illegitimate. Third, their cultural values emphasize individual achievement and innovation, which they believe would be constrained by integration into larger governmental systems. Each point struck at fundamental assumptions that the Dominion had never seriously questioned. The idea that species might prefer self-governance over efficient administration was alien to beings who had spent millennia perfecting centralized authority. The concept that taxation required representation had been obsolete since the development of scientific governance systems that could determine optimal resource allocation without the chaos of democratic input. And the notion that innovation was better served by independence rather than collaboration contradicted everything the Dominion knew about technological development. These motivations appear to be based on fundamental misconceptions about the nature of effective governance, Admiral Korthax observed. Surely they can be corrected through proper education and demonstration of Dominion benefits. Director Mextai's response was delivered with obvious reluctance. Admiral, our psychological profiles suggest that these are not misconceptions that can be corrected through education. They appear to be core cultural values that have been reinforced over thousands of years of human social development. Changing them would require fundamental alterations to human psychology, which is beyond our current capabilities. The implications were staggering. If humanity's rejection was based on unchangeable cultural values rather than correctable misunderstandings, then traditional integration methods would be ineffective. The Dominion had never encountered a species whose basic psychology was incompatible with galactic civilization. The briefing continued with analyses of human economic systems, social structures, and technological development patterns. Each section revealed additional complexities that made humanity increasingly difficult to categorize using standard Dominion models. Their economy was based on competitive innovation rather than centralized planning, yet it had somehow achieved efficiency levels that rivaled the most sophisticated Dominion systems. Their social structures emphasized individual rights and local autonomy, yet they had somehow achieved species-wide cooperation on major projects. Their technological development prioritized versatility and adaptability over specialization, yet they had somehow achieved breakthrough innovations that exceeded Dominion capabilities in several key areas. Every aspect of human civilization seemed to contradict established principles of effective organization, yet the results spoke for themselves. Humanity had achieved in a few centuries what most species required millennia to accomplish, and they had done it without any of the governmental structures that the Dominion considered essential for advanced civilization. As the briefing concluded, the chamber's atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. For 50,000 years, the Dominion had operated on the assumption that their system represented the only viable model for galactic civilization. The existence of a successful alternative challenged everything they believed about governance, economics, and social organization. Overlord ZYX was the first to break the contemplative silence that followed the intelligence presentation. The Council must now determine our response to this unprecedented situation. We have several options available to us, each with significant implications for the future of galactic civilization. The first option was obvious, though none of the assembled representatives wanted to be the first to state it explicitly. The Dominion had overwhelming military superiority, at least in terms of numbers and raw firepower. A direct military intervention could force human compliance, just as similar interventions had resolved resistance movements throughout galactic history. But the intelligence briefing had raised serious questions about the feasibility of military action against humanity. Their dimensional manipulation technology might make them far more difficult to defeat than traditional force projections suggested. Worse still, a military campaign against a species that had refused to join the Dominion might set a precedent that could destabilize relationships with existing members. The second option was negotiation, though Ambassador Chen's statements suggested that humanity's position was non-negotiable. Perhaps alternative arrangements could be developed that would satisfy human cultural requirements while still maintaining Dominion authority and tribute collection. Some form of autonomous membership that preserved the appearance of independence while ensuring continued integration into galactic systems. But such arrangements would inevitably become known to other Dominion members, potentially inspiring similar demands for special treatment. The precedent could lead to the gradual erosion of central authority as more species demanded autonomous status. The third option was simply to ignore humanity and maintain the status quo. Allow them to remain independent while focusing Dominion attention on more cooperative species. This would avoid the risks associated with military action or precedent-setting negotiations, but it would also represent a significant failure of Dominion authority that might encourage other resistance movements. Ambassador Veltar was the first to address the fundamental question that all the options raised. Honored Overlord, perhaps we should consider whether humanity's rejection might indicate flaws in our approach that we have not previously recognized. The suggestion bordered on heresy, but Veltar's status as one of the Dominion's oldest and most respected members gave his words weight that could not be easily dismissed. The Zek and I had been instrumental in developing many of the systems that had made galactic civilization possible, and their perspectives carried significant influence in council deliberations. Ambassador, Overlord ZYX replied carefully, the Dominion system has successfully maintained galactic peace and prosperity for 50,000 years. Are you suggesting that humanity's unprecedented rejection indicates systemic problems rather than human misconceptions? The crystalline being's response was measured and diplomatic, but it contained implications that made several council members visibly uncomfortable. I am suggesting, Overlord, that perhaps our evaluation criteria may have evolved to favor species that are compatible with our existing systems, rather than species that might offer alternative approaches to the challenges of galactic civilization. Humanity's rapid technological development and successful expansion suggest that their methods are effective, even if they differ from our preferred approaches. The observation struck at a possibility that most council members had never seriously considered. What if the Dominion's success was not due to the superiority of their governmental model, but rather to their ability to suppress or assimilate alternative approaches before they could fully develop? What if humanity represented not an aberrant failure to understand proper civilization, but rather a successful alternative that the Dominion had simply never encountered before? Admiral Korthax's response was swift and forceful. Ambassador Veltar, the Dominion's military records clearly demonstrate the consequences of allowing uncontrolled independence. We have extensive documentation of species that attempted autonomous development and fell into warfare, resource depletion, and social collapse. Central authority is not merely preferable, it is essential for advanced civilization. But Director Mextai's intelligence briefing had already undermined the Admiral's argument. Human colonies showed no signs of the instability that Dominion theory predicted for autonomous systems. Instead, they showed evidence of cooperation and coordination that rivaled anything achieved under centralized control. Admiral Korthax, Veltar replied diplomatically, "Our records show the failure of species that attempted independence after exposure to galactic civilization and dominion systems. Humanity developed their approach to interstellar civilization independently, without our influence. Perhaps autonomous development is only unstable when it occurs as a reaction against existing central authority, rather than as an organic evolution of indigenous systems." The distinction was subtle but profound. If Veltar was correct, then, the Dominion's evidence for the necessity of central authority was based on incomplete data. Species that rebelled against Dominion control were attempting to create alternatives while still operating within frameworks designed for centralized governance. Humanity had developed their approach from first principles, without the institutional constraints that might have caused other independence movements to fail. The debate continued for hours, with representatives from dozens of species offering perspectives based on their own experiences with Dominion integration. The older species tended to support Veltar's analysis, noting that their own pre-contact civilizations had achieved significant stability through various forms of local autonomy. The newer species generally supported Admiral Korthax's position, having experienced the benefits of Dominion guidance during their development phases. But, as the discussion progressed, a new concern began to emerge. Several council members noted that word of humanity's rejection had already begun to spread throughout the galactic information networks. Despite efforts to maintain security around the situation, too many beings had been present during Ambassador Chen's statement for the matter to remain classified. The reaction from Dominion member species was beginning to become apparent, and it was not what the Council had expected. Rather than shock or outrage at humanity's presumption, many species were expressing curiosity about human methods and interest in learning more about their approach to interstellar civilization. Some were even beginning to ask whether similar arrangements might be possible for existing Dominion members. "Honored Overlord," reported Information Coordinator Thex Ni, "we are receiving formal inquiries from 17 member species regarding the possibility of renegotiating their tribute arrangements. Additionally, 12 species have submitted requests for detailed information about human governmental and economic systems." The news sent a chill through the assembled representatives. The precedent that everyone had feared was already beginning to manifest. Humanity's rejection was inspiring other species to question arrangements that they had accepted for thousands of years. More troubling still, the initial economic analyses of potential tribute reductions were already showing significant impacts on Dominion financial projections. The galactic economy was based on the assumption that all productive species would contribute according to centrally determined assessments. Even modest reductions in tribute income could force major revisions to infrastructure projects, military expenditures, and technological development programs. The situation was rapidly evolving beyond a simple matter of one species' refusal to join the Dominion. It was becoming a fundamental challenge to the entire structure of galactic civilization. Overlord Zyxthara found herself facing a decision that no previous Dominion leader had ever confronted. For 50,000 years, the response to resistance had been straightforward, overwhelming force followed by integration. But humanity presented complexities that made traditional solutions potentially counterproductive. Military action might succeed in forcing human compliance, but it would also demonstrate that the Dominion's authority ultimately rested on coercion rather than the mutual benefit that official propaganda claimed. Such a demonstration might inspire more resistance than it suppressed, particularly given the questions that other species were already beginning to ask. Negotiation might preserve peace and avoid the precedent-setting implications of military action, but it would also acknowledge that Dominion authority was not absolute. Once that acknowledgement was made, every future integration would become a potential negotiation rather than a simple imposition of established terms. Ignoring humanity might avoid immediate confrontation, but it would also represent a visible failure of Dominion authority that could encourage other independence movements. Worse still, humanity's continued success as an autonomous civilization might serve as a constant demonstration that alternatives to Dominion membership were possible. As the emergency session stretched into its second day, the Council began to realize that they were facing more than a diplomatic crisis. They were confronting fundamental questions about the nature of galactic civilization itself, questions that had been assumed settled for millennia. The answers they chose would determine not only humanity's fate, but the future of the Dominion itself. And, in human space, Ambassador Chen was delivering her own report to the leaders who had sent her to face the galaxy's greatest power with a single, simple word that had shattered 50,000 years of unquestioned authority. The word that had changed everything: no. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Chen's historic refusal, and the galaxy was transforming in ways that no one had anticipated. The emergency session of the Galactic Dominion Council had lasted for 6 days before concluding with a decision that satisfied no one but seemed to be the only option that might preserve some semblance of stability. The official response had been carefully crafted to maintain Dominion authority while avoiding the immediate risks of military confrontation. Humanity would be granted provisional autonomous status pending further evaluation of their governmental systems. This arrangement would allow them to remain independent while keeping the door open for future integration once they had matured sufficiently to appreciate the benefits of galactic civilization. It was a face-saving measure that fooled no one, least of all the human government that had never asked for provisional anything. But it had bought time, and time was what the Council desperately needed as the implications of humanity's rejection continued to ripple throughout the galaxy. In the Terran Colonial Administration headquarters on Luna, Director Elizabeth Morrison was reviewing the latest intelligence reports from across human space. The past 3 months had been among the most eventful in human history, as word of their confrontation with the Dominion had spread to every human colony and sparked intense debate about humanity's future in the galaxy. The human response had been characteristically complex and varied. Some colonies had expressed concern about the risks of defying a power that controlled most of the galaxy. Others had celebrated humanity's refusal to bow to alien authority. But the majority had simply gotten back to work, treating the Dominion situation as another challenge to be solved rather than an existential crisis to be feared. That practical approach had served humanity well during the 3 months of uncertainty that followed Chen's declaration. While the Dominion Council debated and delayed, human colonies had quietly strengthened their defenses, expanded their intelligence networks, and continued their technological development programs. If the Dominion eventually decided on military action, they would find humanity considerably better prepared than their initial assessments had suggested. But the most significant developments were occurring not in human space, but throughout the Dominion itself. Director Morrison's intelligence teams had documented a cascade of events that suggested the galactic political landscape was undergoing fundamental changes. The first major development had occurred just 2 weeks after the emergency session concluded. The Valkyrie Synthesis, a confederation of 12 star systems that had been Dominion members for over 8,000 years, had formally requested a reduction in their tribute obligations. Their petition cited economic hardships and requested permission to reallocate resources from tribute payments to infrastructure development. The request itself was not unprecedented. The Dominion had occasionally adjusted tribute requirements for species experiencing legitimate difficulties. But the Valkyrie petition was different in both scope and reasoning. They were not claiming hardship, but rather questioning the value they received in exchange for their tribute payments. They wanted to know exactly what services the Dominion provided that justified the 23% of gross planetary production they were required to contribute annually. When the Dominion's response had been evasive, citing proprietary information and the complexity of galactic resource allocation, the Valkyrie had done something even more unprecedented. They had hired human consultants to conduct an independent analysis of Dominion economic systems. The human team, led by economist Dr. James Park, had delivered a report that sent shockwaves through both Valkyrie space and the wider galactic community. According to their analysis, the Valkyrie received direct benefits worth approximately 7% of their tribute payments, with the remaining 16% being used to support Dominion administrative costs, military operations in other sectors, and infrastructure projects that provided no measurable benefit to Valkyrie citizens. In essence, the Valkyrie were paying to subsidize the Dominion's control over species they had never met and would never interact with. The economic relationship was fundamentally extractive rather than beneficial. The revelation had triggered similar analyses throughout the galaxy as other species began questioning their own tribute arrangements. Human economic consultants were suddenly in high demand, their services being requested by dozens of Dominion members who wanted independent assessments of their relationships with galactic civilization. The results were uniformly troubling for the Dominion. Species after species discovered that they were net contributors to galactic systems that provided them with little or no direct benefit. The tribute system that had been presented as mutual cooperation was revealed to be a mechanism for transferring wealth from productive colonies to the central administration and its oldest, most powerful members. But economic analysis was only one aspect of the growing crisis facing Dominion authority. The second major development had been the emergence of what human observers were calling the information revolution. For 50,000 years, the Dominion had maintained strict control over information flow between member species. Each civilization received carefully curated data about galactic affairs, with access to detailed information being restricted to those with demonstrated loyalty to Dominion principles. This system had prevented the emergence of coordinated resistance movements while ensuring that potentially destabilizing ideas could not spread rapidly throughout the galactic community. But humanity's rejection had demonstrated the value of unrestricted information access. The human intelligence gathering operation had been successful precisely because they had refused to accept Dominion restrictions on what they could learn about galactic civilization. Their comprehensive analysis had enabled them to make informed decisions about their relationship with the galaxy's dominant power. Other species had taken note of this success, and many were beginning to question why they should accept information restrictions that limited their ability to understand their own circumstances. Underground networks for sharing prohibited information were beginning to emerge, often facilitated by human communication technologies that the Dominion had difficulty monitoring or controlling. The third major development was perhaps the most significant: the emergence of alternative models for interstellar cooperation. Inspired by humanity's success with decentralized governance, several groups of Dominion member species were beginning to explore possibilities for regional cooperation that bypassed central authority. The most advanced of these efforts was the Outer Rim Cooperative, a loose alliance of 15 species located in the galaxy's frontier regions. These civilizations had always been marginal members of the Dominion, contributing more in tribute than they received in benefits while being largely ignored by the central administration. Their proposal was radical in its simplicity: they would reduce their tribute payments to the Dominion while increasing their cooperation with each other, creating a regional network for trade, defense, and technological sharing. The cooperative's organizers had been careful to present their proposal as a supplement to Dominion membership rather than a replacement for it. They emphasized their continued loyalty to galactic civilization while requesting permission to experiment with alternative approaches to regional governance. But the implications were clear to everyone involved. If the Outer Rim Cooperative succeeded, it would demonstrate that the benefits of interstellar cooperation could be achieved without the costs of central authority. These three developments had created a crisis of legitimacy that the Dominion was struggling to address. For the first time in millennia, member species were openly questioning the fundamental assumptions upon which galactic civilization was based. The revelation that tribute arrangements were primarily extractive had undermined the economic justification for Dominion authority. The information revolution was exposing the extent to which member species had been kept ignorant of their own circumstances. And the emergence of alternative cooperation models was demonstrating that interstellar civilization was possible without central control. Director Morrison's latest intelligence report painted a picture of a galactic community in transition. The Dominion's authority was not collapsing, but it was being questioned in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. More importantly, the questioning was leading to action as species began exploring alternatives to the systems that had governed the galaxy for 50,000 years. The human role in these developments had been carefully calibrated to avoid direct confrontation while encouraging independent thinking. Human consultants provided economic analysis and technical assistance, but they avoided making political recommendations or advocating for specific governmental systems. Human communication technologies facilitated information sharing, but humans did not control the content being shared. Human examples inspired alternative approaches, but humans did not attempt to impose their methods on other species. The approach reflected a fundamental difference between human and Dominion philosophies of interstellar relations. Where the Dominion sought to impose uniformity through central control, humans encouraged diversity through decentralized cooperation. Where the Dominion demanded tribute in exchange for protection, humans offered technical assistance in exchange for mutual benefit. Where the Dominion restricted information to maintain stability, humans shared knowledge to enable informed decision-making. But the human approach was not without its costs. 3 separate assassination attempts had been made against human diplomats, apparently organized by Dominion intelligence services. Human trade ships were being subjected to increasingly aggressive inspections and delays when passing through Dominion space. And there were persistent rumors that the Dominion military was developing new weapons specifically designed to counter human dimensional manipulation technology. The pressure was building toward some form of confrontation, and both sides were preparing for possibilities that neither wanted to contemplate. The Dominion could not allow the precedent of successful resistance to spread unchecked, but military action against humanity risked triggering the very rebellion that they were trying to prevent. Humanity could not back down from their position without abandoning the principles that had made their civilization successful, but continued defiance risked eventually provoking a war they were not certain they could win. It was Ambassador Veltar of the Zekanai who proposed the solution that would eventually reshape galactic civilization. The Zekanai were uniquely positioned to broker a resolution to the growing crisis. As one of the Dominion's founding species, they had the authority to propose fundamental changes to galactic systems. As beings who had voluntarily joined the Dominion to escape natural disaster rather than being conquered or coerced, they had the credibility to advocate for reforms that preserved the benefits of cooperation while addressing the legitimate concerns of member species. Veltar's proposal was elegantly simple and radically transformative. Instead of trying to force uniformity throughout the galaxy, the Dominion should formally recognize diversity as a strength. Different species could participate in galactic civilization through different arrangements, ranging from full membership with traditional tribute obligations to loose association with minimal requirements. The key principle would be voluntary participation based on informed consent rather than imposed obligation based on assumed authority. The proposal addressed the fundamental issues that had created the crisis while preserving the essential functions that made galactic civilization valuable. Species that wanted the security and stability of central authority could continue to participate in traditional Dominion systems. Species that preferred local autonomy could form regional cooperatives that maintained connections to the broader galactic community without surrendering their independence. And species like humanity that had developed successful alternative approaches could serve as laboratories for testing new models of interstellar cooperation. The economic implications were complex but potentially beneficial for everyone involved. Instead of the extractive tribute system that had evolved over millennia of central control, the new arrangement would be based on voluntary contribution to shared projects that provided measurable benefits to all participants. Species would pay for what they used and benefit from what they contributed, creating incentives for efficient cooperation rather than exploitative extraction. The political implications were even more profound. For the first time in 50,000 years, galactic civilization would be based on the consent of the governed rather than the authority of the governors. Species would choose their level of participation based on their own assessment of costs and benefits rather than having arrangements imposed upon them by distant authorities who might not understand their needs or circumstances. The proposal faced massive resistance from the Dominion's traditional power structure. Military leaders argued that diversity would lead to instability and conflict. Economic administrators claimed that voluntary systems could not provide the resources necessary for galactic-scale projects. Political authorities insisted that central control was essential for maintaining the unity that had prevented major wars for millennia. But the crisis was forcing a fundamental re-evaluation of assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. The current system was already producing instability as more and more species questioned arrangements that no longer served their interests. The extractive economic model was generating resentment that threatened the very cooperation it was supposed to ensure. And the unity imposed by central authority was proving to be brittle when challenged by determined resistance. The debate that followed Veltar's proposal lasted for months and involved every major species in the galactic community. Public forums were held throughout Dominion space, allowing ordinary citizens to express their views on fundamental questions about the nature of their civilization. Information restrictions were relaxed to enable informed discussion of alternatives that had never been publicly considered. The process was chaotic, contentious, and occasionally heated as beings grappled with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about effective governance. But it was also democratic in a way that galactic civilization had never experienced, giving voice to billions of citizens who had never before been asked what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in. The human contribution to these debates was characteristically practical rather than ideological. When asked about their governmental systems, human representatives emphasized that their approach was not necessarily superior to others, but rather that it had evolved to suit their specific circumstances and values. They encouraged other species to develop arrangements that reflected their own needs rather than simply copying human methods. When pressed about the risks of decentralized governance, humans acknowledged the potential for conflict and inefficiency while pointing out that centralized systems had their own risks of corruption and stagnation. The goal was not to eliminate risk, but to ensure that each species could choose the risks they preferred to accept rather than having risks imposed upon them by others. The final resolution of the crisis came not through military action or political maneuvering, but through the simple recognition that diversity might be a strength rather than a weakness. The new galactic confederation that emerged from the debates retained many of the beneficial functions of the old Dominion while abandoning the extractive and authoritarian aspects that had generated so much resentment. Under the new system, humanity's autonomous status was not an exception to be reluctantly tolerated, but rather one option among many that species could choose based on their own circumstances and preferences. The Outer Rim Cooperative became the first of several regional associations that provided alternatives to central authority. Traditional Dominion members who preferred the security of centralized governance continued to participate in systems that were reformed to be more transparent and accountable. Most importantly, the new arrangement was based on a principle that had been absent from galactic politics for 50,000 years, the recognition that legitimate government requires the consent of the governed. The transformation was not immediate or complete. Implementing new systems of voluntary cooperation required years of negotiation and adjustment as species learned to work together as equals rather than subjects. Some traditional Dominion members chose to maintain their old arrangements, preferring familiar stability to uncertain alternatives. A few species attempted to exploit the transition period for territorial expansion or resource grabbing, requiring intervention to maintain basic order. But the overall result was a galactic civilization that was more diverse, more dynamic, and more responsive to the needs of its citizens than anything that had existed before. Trade flourished as species were free to develop economic relationships based on mutual benefit rather than centralized allocation. Technological innovation accelerated as beings could share discoveries without bureaucratic restrictions. Cultural exchange expanded as civilizations could interact directly rather than through official channels. Perhaps most significantly, the new galaxy proved to be more peaceful rather than less so. Conflicts that arose could be addressed through regional mechanisms that understood local circumstances rather than distant authorities that might not appreciate the complexities involved. Species that felt their voices were heard and their choices respected were less likely to resort to violence than those who felt their concerns were ignored by unresponsive governments. Ambassador Chen, now serving as humanity's first representative to the Galactic Confederation Council, often reflected on the simple word that had started the transformation. No had been more than a rejection of tribute demands, it had been an assertion of the principle that sapient beings deserved the right to determine their own destiny. That principle had proven to be more powerful than any weapon, more persuasive than any argument, and more transformative than any technology. It had reminded the galaxy that government existed to serve the governed, not the other way around. The Dominion's collapse had not been violent or sudden. It had simply become irrelevant as the beings it claimed to serve discovered better ways to achieve the cooperation and prosperity that made interstellar civilization possible. The 50,000-year reign of imposed unity had ended not with conquest or rebellion, but with the quiet recognition that diversity and choice might serve the common good better than uniformity and control. In human space, children learned the story of Ambassador Chen's single word as an example of how individuals could change history through the simple act of refusing to accept injustice. In the wider galaxy, the story became a reminder that even the most powerful systems were ultimately dependent on the consent of those they governed. The word no had shattered an empire built on the assumption that consent was unnecessary. The galaxy that emerged from the ruins was more complex, more challenging, and more uncertain than what had come before. But it was also more free, and that freedom had proven to be worth whatever difficulties it brought. The Galactic Confederation thrived not because it imposed perfect solutions, but because it allowed imperfect beings to work together toward common goals while respecting their differences. It was a lesson that would shape interstellar civilization for millennia to come, all because one species had the courage to say no to a system that demanded their submission without earning their consent. In the end, humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization was not their technology or their military capabilities, but their reminder that the ultimate authority in any just government must come from those it claims to serve. That principle had transformed a galaxy and ensured that no species would ever again have to choose between freedom and prosperity. The stars belonged to all who could reach them, not to those who claimed the right to rule them.